So there was this boogeyman of, oh, the renters are coming. And that was a lot of the pushback. And what the Housing Club was trying to communicate during this time is, first of all, you don't understand who the renters are. Like,
they're your children.
They're your kids. They're your attorney. They're your insurance agent. There are all kinds of people who are renting in Anchorage for reasons that we discussed earlier. There's not a house for them to buy in a reasonable price range. So they're a tenant right now.
Mm-hmm. Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell the stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. Today, our guest is Erin Baldwin Day. She is the founder of the Mutual Aid Network of Anchorage, and she is an organizer of the Anchorage Housing Club. We will be discussing her work in eviction prevention, tenants' rights, and the need for more housing in Anchorage. Erin Baldwin Day, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Tell us a little bit about yourself. Where did you grow up?
I grew up here in Anchorage. I'm your classic Anchorage boomerang kid. So I spent 17 years of the first 18 years of my life here. I grew up mostly on the east side. I graduated from East High School, went to Texas for about a decade for college and life development things.
Where'd you go to school in Texas?
Abilene Christian University.
Oh.
Yeah, that is a whole other story of the trajectory of my life. But yeah, small private school in West Texas. Absolute culture shock going from Anchorage to Abilene. But I ended up coming back to Alaska in 2009, at that point married with two very small children. And yeah, I actually live down the street and around the corner from the last house I lived in Geneva Woods. And yeah, have made my life and raised my family here.
Tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing now and how you came to that work.
Sure. I have the privilege of having my fingers in a lot of little pies at this point. So I am the lead organizer for Mutual Aid Network of Anchorage, which is much easier compressed into the acronym MANA. And that was work that started as a direct response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And it was purely an effort to try to make sure that resources were shared within neighborhoods, that our neighbors' basic needs were met, especially during that long period of uncertainty where there were certain supplies that you couldn't access all the time. And people were looking for help with groceries and PPE and medication delivery and those kinds of things. And so that's how MANA was born. And it has now evolved into an entity that still continues to help provide for basic needs and is still deeply rooted in community generosity. But now we do other things as well. We've done some work with payday lending reform. We're currently doing some work around eviction intervention and prevention work, and starting to find our way into the conversation around the tenants' rights and tenant education. And so that's one bucket of work that I do is mutual aid. Something that is adjacent to that is work organizing a group called Anchorage Housing Club, which is a collection of citizens, individuals here in Anchorage who are really interested in making housing options more abundant and trying to think about how do we use the space that we have? How do we use the land in Anchorage? Not just in terms of housing, but also in terms of how our transportation is structured. Because you really can't talk about housing without talking about transportation and how we actually get around our town. So that's another bucket of work that I'm involved in. And then I'm involved in an effort to stand up a worker-owned childcare cooperative. That's another really salient issue here. As I'm sure many of your listeners are aware, there's a total lack of childcare, and also a need for childcare workers to be more empowered and to be better compensated for the very critical service that they provide. I would argue that childcare workers are an engine of our economy because childcare professionals are the folks that allow many of our citizens to go to work. And so when we don't have childcare, when we don't have those options available, everybody suffers. That's another piece of work that I'm currently involved in. And then some other little fun projects on the side. But those are the three main things that I'm involved in right now.
What did you study at university? How did you feel prepared to do this kind of work?
I think that the short answer is I didn't. I did not feel at all prepared. And there are some days where I still don't. And I think, so I studied political science. Full disclosure, I actually left that university for personal reasons without finishing my degree. So I have a whole lot of credits that don't add up to an actual diploma, which I know is the story for a lot of folks. Came to this work from a place of necessity because I perceived that there were needs in the community. And I have been a learner all along the way. And I like to say that I am not an expert of any of these things. I'm a practitioner. I'm a curious person. And so when a need presents itself, I view it like a puzzle, right? There are all sorts of pieces that come together to build a solution. And so I do my best to talk to people who are smarter than me and to connect with people who have more experience than I do or more specific content expertise. But I wouldn't say that I did anything specific to be prepared for what I do now, other than to be very curious and to commit myself to learning something new as often as I can and to partnering with people. I think that's maybe the key, is to really partner with folks who are more of an expert than I am. Some of the professional work that I've done in the nonprofit sector and the faith leadership sector have also really informed that approach. I'm frequently not the smartest person in the room, but I can be the most creative. And I think that's what I have brought to this, is that sense of, if we have the right people and the right energy, we can do anything. We can solve anything that's in front of us.
I'm super grateful for that, and inspirational for listeners to hear that you don't have to have a certain degree or a certain field of expertise to be able to really get involved in issues and work on them in a substantive, meaningful way.
Yes. Yes. I think if there is a drum that I could bang about public engagement, about individuals engaging in advocacy or any kind of public or political work, I would say that it doesn't require expertise. It requires that you care about your neighbors. And I think caring about your neighbors and believing that solutions are possible, like I think of that as like a little bit of defiant hope, that even in the face of some really significant structural barriers, we can still make substantive change happen. I think if you have those ingredients, it's not about the degree. It's not about whatever professional expertise you might have. I think there is always space for people to engage. And I wish there wasn't that perception that you have to be a professional, you have to be a politician, you have to be some kind of degreed or diplomaed expert in order to weigh in on these conversations. You really just have to care about your community and be willing to listen.
I particularly want to talk about two of the issues that you work on. One is tenant rights, and the other is increasing the supply of housing in Anchorage. I sincerely appreciate payday loaning reform, childcare, but just for the purposes of this conversation, we're going to narrow it down.
Great.
So let's start with tenant rights and your work in the tenant right area. What do you see as being the biggest challenges that renters face in Anchorage today?
Oh, that's a great question. I think there are three challenges that I would point to. And the first challenge is the lack of availability of rental units in this town. Right now, the occupancy rate for apartments in Anchorage hovers right around 95 to 97%, which basically means that all of the apartments in Anchorage are currently occupied. And what that indicates is that there are folks looking for apartments who can't find them. And it also means that landlords, when they evict someone or when someone's rental agreement turns over from an annual agreement to something that's month to month, it is very easy for a landlord to, for a variety of reasons, remove a tenant from their apartment and immediately replace them. So there's really not a lot of incentive for landlords to, for example, manage prices or take care of maintenance issues or to retain tenants for any reason, because they know that as soon as one tenant moves on, there will be a slew of other applicants looking for a place to live.
Willing to possibly pay a higher rent.
Exactly. Willing to possibly pay a higher rent. And so that in itself, the fact that we have this very high demand and short supply is a major challenge for tenants. I think another thing I would point to is a lot of tenants don't understand what rights they do and don't have. And when someone, for example, might get into a situation where a maintenance request isn't being handled appropriately, or where they're unable to contact a landlord, or where they think they might be mischarged or overcharged, or a fee appears on their ledger that they don't understand. There's really not a mechanism apart from a couple of smaller operations with Alaska Legal Services and things of that nature. There isn't a mechanism for tenants to call someone and say, I don't think this is right. Can you help me decide whether it is or isn't? And so what you have is a lot of tenants who will just pay the fee or pay out of pocket for their own repairs or take on the burden of managing their own space without understanding that they really could compel their landlord to do that. And I think that's also problematic.
I'm just really quick going to say that Alaska Legal Services does have a renters hotline.
Yes.
The Alaska Legal Services Landlord and Tenant Helpline is 1-855-743-1001. And that phone line is answered Monday through Thursday from 6 to 8 p.m. Alaska time.
Yes.
And just acknowledging that sometimes there's a lot of folks calling in. You may be on hold for a long time, but they can give you objective advice about what your rights are or aren't in that case. When I started diving into this, I was really looking to educate my constituents who are renters about what their rights are. And I think I was surprised at how often it's the landlord that has the right, not the tenant.
Yes.
In terms of being able to increase rent as much as they want, being able to, as long as they give a 30-day notice, increase it multiple times in a single year.
Yes.
I don't know if you can speak about that.
To some degree, yes. And that was actually the third challenge that I was going to point to for tenants, and especially with the market forces that I alluded to earlier, is that there really is nothing to stop. There's no ceiling. There's nothing to stop landlords from continuing to increase rent month over month, year over year, those kinds of things. And so the mutual aid network received all kinds of stories and requests for assistance, starting with COVID and then moving into the present. And some of those were stories of people who were on a month-to-month lease, which meant the landlord could raise rent again with 30 days notice, where they had experienced an increase in their rent 6 months in a row. And the sum total of that increase was 50% of the original rental rate. For someone who is potentially on a fixed income, for someone who's an hourly wage worker, even if it's not minimum wage, that kind of increase is unsustainable. And we were having folks contact the network and saying, I can't afford to pay my rent anymore. Or I can afford to pay my rent, but it represents 80% of my income now. And I don't know what to do because I'm having to choose between paying my rent and feeding my kids, or paying my rent and paying for childcare so I can continue to go to work. So because there's no ceiling, there's no effective ceiling, it has meant that over the course of the last 4 to 5 years, we've seen significant increases in rent up to 40, 50%. Just in Anchorage. And that is not something that we can continue to do and expect our workforce to be able to live here.
And I would say that the conservative argument would be that there is an inherent ceiling. Once you've crossed the moment where no one can afford it anymore, then the ceiling has been reached. Mm-hmm. And that the free market, once these rents get to a certain amount, should incentivize construction of new apartment buildings, because folks will see just how much money is there to be, that pencils out.
Sure.
If you're able to charge, $1,600 a month for a 1-bedroom apartment, then you could build a building of 1-bedroom apartments and it will pencil out. We're in a perfect storm situation right now, though, where none of those are getting built.
My pushback to that argument would be that might be true if we were living in a city where there was also available housing stock. So right now you have a large swath of what we would probably call our middle class that is actively renting because there is no property for them to buy. And they could purchase property. They could purchase something if, we had homes available in that middle price range, that missing middle that, people in housing circles talk about a lot.
Like 200 to 350.
Right. 200. Yeah. Yes. 200 to 350, 400,000.
Mm-hmm.
If you look around Anchorage right now, and if you're searching for a home that is in that price range, good luck. Good luck. And so we have all of these folks who could be paying mortgages rather than paying rent, but we don't have that housing stock available. And so those folks can absorb some of these increases that we're talking about. But there are many folks who need to stay in rentals because they don't have an immediate path to homeownership right now, that are being squeezed out. And as we are watching our population of unhoused folks grow, as there are more of our neighbors who are losing access to housing, I think we are seeing this perfect storm. We don't have enough rentals. We don't have enough housing writ large. And so we are going to continue to see this bleed of people who are either becoming unhoused or folks who are in that missing middle who are leaving the state because they don't see a path to a homeowning future here in Alaska. So we're seeing the bleed from both directions. And I think that is an argument that the market will take care of itself kind of thing doesn't account for. Like, none of these things are happening in a vacuum, and all of these issues are interrelated. And so I think that conservative argument starts to fall on its face a little bit, because we do have a large subset of our population that will not be able to afford rent, but they also won't be able to afford to leave. And I think that's where we're headed. That's what's happening. And if what's happening with what I'm hearing inside of the mutual aid network is any indication, it's already happening and it's only going to accelerate.
What is your organization able to do when you get those calls saying, the example you use, someone that's been increased 50%, I'm paying the majority of my income towards rent, I can't afford childcare anymore, I'm going to go to work. What do you do? What do you say?
Oh, I hate those calls. MANA is entirely funded by community generosity. We don't currently receive any sort of grant-making support or state or federal support for the work that we do. So sometimes, depending on what our financial picture looks like as an entity, we can offer like a month's worth of breathing room. So we can say, okay, we're looking at what's happening here. We can step in. MANA and our very generous network members can pay 1 month of your rent to give you a little space to breathe. That does happen. Sometimes those folks are entitled to services that they don't know that they qualify for. And so we will do our best to steer folks in the direction of other supports that might be available to them, whether that is childcare assistance, whether that is SNAP, whether that is potentially qualifying for some other form of housing support. But we try to connect people with other sources of community support, social services support. And sometimes the heartbreaking answer is there's nothing we can do. And those are the worst conversations because, someone has just privileged you with their story, with this very vulnerable moment in their life. And to just say, I affirm where you are not the only person that is in this situation. And there's really nothing that we can do for you at this moment, maybe apart from, can we deliver you some groceries? Can we give you a gas card, which is a tiny little drop in the bucket. We try to provide as much support as we can for each family, for each household that approaches MANA, but sometimes we're tapped out. And those are the hard times. Those are the really hard times.
It sounds like that a problem that you see is the ability of a landlord to raise the rent as much as they want, as often as they want, with a 30-day notice. Mm-hmm. And so some reforms around that might be indicated.
Oh my goodness. Yes. Game changer.
Are there any other rights that you feel tenants should be entitled to that they're currently not?
Sure. Yeah. There's like a menu that comes to mind. So right now, the law around returning a deposit to a tenant upon move out is very murky and is very tipped in favor of the landlord. There's practically no burden of proof on the landlord to prove that the security deposit should have been retained. And even if a tenant has significant proof that they left the property in immaculate condition, that they cleaned the carpet, that there were no stains on the floors, that the walls were pristine, right?
The oven was spotless.
And the oven was spotless, right? Even if there is a like walk around video that a tenant can produce that shows the condition of their apartment upon move out, oftentimes that is not enough to compel a landlord to return the entirety of a security deposit. And what's really yucky about that is that oftentimes a tenant needs that security deposit to be able to move into another unit. So I'm intimately acquainted with several scenarios where this was the case, where someone was moving out of one apartment because the rent had increased so much, and they had found another place that was comparable, but several $100s less expensive for a similar space. They were counting on having the security deposit returned to them so that they could pay the deposit on the next space. And then the security deposit was not returned. And so now they're in this double bind where they owe a security deposit to a new landlord and they're already behind the 8 ball. Mm-hmm. And if they want their security deposit back from their landlord, they may or may not understand what they need to do in order to get the security deposit back. And really what that involves is small claims court. Mm-hmm. And for a lot of people, number one, any kind of legal proceeding is really intimidating, especially if you're shouldering it by yourself. It takes a lot of time. It takes some level of like awareness of what's the first step even.
Right. Knowing how to do it.
And
I wouldn't know how.
Yeah. I didn't know how until I started doing some of this eviction intervention work. That alone, requiring landlords to actually prove why they decided to retain a security deposit or having something that protects renters, because that there's a significant power differential there. Mm-hmm. Like we have to name that, right? We have to name that there's a significant power differential between a tenant and a landlord. And in that scenario, in most scenarios, the landlord holds all the power.
I'm very sensitive to this issue because years ago, I rented an apartment for 18 months. And I'd had and it was a large apartment complex. So it was like a sort of corporate run apartment complex. And I didn't really use my oven. And they kept over half my deposit because, and it was like they pulled out this paperwork that I'd signed that said something like, if I'd lived there for 3 years, then they would understand that they would need to replace the carpet at no charge to me. If I'd lived there for 3 years, then it would be repainted and it would just be part of that's like the wear and tear. Mm. But because I'd lived there for only 18 months, then it had this percentage that I had to pay to replace things when, and I'm just saying this because I know people go through this. I had a very cordial relationship with the person in the office. Mm-hmm. The moment I was like, no, I just spent all day making sure that apartment is spotless. I barely use that oven. And they were like, this is the rules and this is the way it is. And we keep this much and you get this much. And their interaction with me was hostile. Yes. It was like, they went from being like, oh, so good to see you to no, you signed it. That's the way it is. Yeah. It doesn't matter how much you cleaned. We keep this much.
Yes, exactly.
And I was like, I guess I don't have any recourse here.
Because you signed on the dotted line. Which I think is another piece of protection that I could envision, is a simplification of the documentation that a renter signs that makes it very clear. Because a lot of times those clauses, those provisions around, for example, if we initiate an eviction proceeding, how much can we charge you in legal fees, right? That is in most rental agreements, but it's
so if they evict you, they're going to charge you fees related to that eviction.
Correct.
And I know this from previous podcast that the most common reason for eviction is failure to pay rent.
Yes.
And failure to pay rent means you don't have money.
Yes. And so I've been in several scenarios where someone was able to come up with the bulk of a rent payment to avoid eviction. Mana was able to provide some top-off funding just to make sure that the rent was paid in full with any additional late fees. And then the next month, there's a $590 legal fee tacked on to the rent.
This is happening in Anchorage.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And at least from inside of Mana, right? I've heard this story now like once a month since January. So now you have $600 in legal fees that you technically signed a paper that said you would pay them. And it is entirely legal for the landlord to collect those fees from you, even if you never showed up in court, even if the eviction proceeding never got as far as a hearing in a courtroom, they can still charge you $590 for legal fees.
It's
Astonishing.
crazy.
Yeah, astonishing. Especially when you consider that most of the property in Anchorage is owned by a corporation, and this corporation does not need to retain an attorney every time they initiate an eviction proceeding, right? It's not legitimately costing $590.
They know what they're doing. They've done this a million
They've done
times.
this a million times.
And I want to talk about that because I think that's something that listeners may not be aware of. They think of apartment buildings as being owned by, I don't know, individuals.
A local guy, a local
person.
gal.
And if there's like every different apartment complex has a different owner, but that's not the case in Anchorage.
Mm-hmm.
The majority of rentals are owned by a single entity.
That is correct.
And it's basically a monopoly.
Mm-hmm. So conservative estimates would say that there is one corporate landlord in Anchorage that owns approximately 80 to 85% of all rental properties. And some of that's murky. There are some reports that suggest that number is actually closer to 90% of rentals. Apartment properties in Anchorage are owned and managed by a single entity.
I did attempt to fact check those numbers. Getting exact percentages, though, was not possible. But everyone I polled, folks from Alaska Housing Finance Corporation, the Anchorage Coalition to End Homelessness, Rural Cap, they all agreed that Widener does own a high percentage of the rental market in Anchorage, well over 50%. The only actual figure I could come up with was from 2018, and based on those numbers, Widener owned 62% of Anchorage's rental units.
So if you were evicted from one of those properties, how easy would it be for you to rent at a different property that corporation owned?
Practically impossible. Yeah, practically impossible because there is record in their system that you were evicted. And even if that eviction is not, for example, visible on court view, it's internally visible inside of the Widener system. And so it's extraordinarily difficult to rent from that entity again. And part of that also means that if you do rent again, it is likely that your security deposit will be higher and that you will immediately be met with a certain amount of skepticism, a certain amount of...
Your fine print is going to be...
Pretty fine. Yes, exactly. And so that, again, that's a deeply problematic scenario when you consider that one landlord is essentially managing most of the large properties that you see when you drive around Anchorage, even though the names are all different. And even though people might be writing checks to different sub-entities, the parent company is the same.
Mm-hmm. That's the problem.
That's the problem. Yeah.
I want to pivot and talk about the Housing Alliance. What are y'all called?
Anchorage Housing Club. Yes.
Anchorage Housing Club, which I understand their goal is to increase the amount of available housing in Anchorage.
Correct.
Talk a little bit about their approach and philosophy and what your thoughts are on increasing the amount of available housing in Anchorage.
Sure. So I'm going to get a little nerdy for a minute. So there are some factors that influence the amount of housing that's available, not just in Anchorage, but really all across Alaska. Some of those factors are within our control, and some of them are not. So some of the factors that are outside of our control are availability of construction materials, the price point of those materials, the availability and the cost of the skilled labor required to build housing, and then the amount of money, the amount of capital, the amount of dollars that are available to do the work of developing or redeveloping housing. Those things are mostly outside of our immediate control. What is within the immediate control of an entity like Housing Club and the places where we can exert influence is what are the barriers to actually building housing based on the law, based on what the law says about where housing can be built and how that housing should look. And the nerdy way of talking about that is zoning, which is the law around where housing can be built, and then the building code, which is what that housing should look like and how it should behave. Some of the building code is about life, health, and safety. It's about making sure that a building isn't going to fall down in an earthquake, or that the stairs are actually walkable, or that the foundation is poured a certain way, right? There are certain things about the building code that are very helpful and valuable. There are certain things about zoning that are very helpful and valuable. There are also things about zoning and building codes that are really inherently problematic. So I'll talk a little bit about zoning first. So one of the things that's problematic about zoning is that it has often been used, frequently been used, as a way of dividing populations into the haves and the have-nots. Zoning also has a very ugly racist history. It was zoning that was used as a mechanism to be sure that Black families couldn't buy housing in white neighborhoods. And we think of that as being a problem someplace else, but that was true in Anchorage. Zoning was brought to bear to make sure that there were certain neighborhoods where Black and brown families could not buy. As recently as the 1960s.
Cal Williams was our guest for July 4th, and he talked about Fairview and Eastchester, and like a lowland area that was super muddy, particularly during breakup, and that this was unpaved roads and predominantly Black ownership, and cars being like in 6 inches of mud in March and April, and that was where they could buy houses.
Yes. So that is part of our city's history, is this very discriminatory kind of zoning practice. And we still see some remnants of that in the way that our zoning is currently, right? I guess it's shifted now because we've just passed some really important legislation here in the municipality called the Home Initiative that has essentially eliminated single family zoning, meaning neighborhoods where you can only build a single family house on a lot. So there are opportunities to shift our zoning code in Anchorage to make it possible to build lots of different types of housing in lots of different places. That is a very positive change. And I think that's the first of many changes that need to happen in order to make it possible for new homes to be built or for existing homes to be renovated.
What was the pushback on that?
Oh, goodness. There were a lot of folks who hold a belief that single-family neighborhoods are inherently better. And there was a lot of communication around the fact that preserving, and I'm going to use my bunny ears here, my bunny ears quote fingers, neighborhood character. That if we eliminated single-family zoning, there would be places where the neighborhood character would be ruined. And that pushback was coming from Rogers Park and Turnagain and South Addition and Rabbit Creek, and folks from largely the community councils who were saying, no, wait, our neighborhood is
perfect the way it is.
Perfect the way it is. And we actually don't want duplexes or triplexes or ADUs, accessory dwelling units, mother-in-law apartments. Like, we don't want that because that'll ruin our neighborhood. Never mind that there are already duplexes in Rogers Park. There are already duplexes in South Addition. There are already duplexes in Rabbit Creek and Turnagain. And it hasn't wrecked anything. The specter of, oh my gosh, there will be duplexes everywhere tomorrow was enough to really ramp up the anxiety about, well, what's going to happen to my neighborhood? And will we suddenly have
Renters.
the renters? There was this boogeyman of like,
People who use the bus.
Yes, exactly. Exactly that. So there was this boogeyman of, oh, the renters are coming. And that was a lot of the pushback. And what the Housing Club was trying to communicate during this time is, first of all, you don't understand who the renters are. Like,
They're your children.
They're your kids. They're your attorney. They're your insurance agent. There are all kinds of people who are renting in Anchorage for reasons that we discussed earlier. There's not a house for them to buy in a reasonable price range. So they're a tenant right now.
Mm-hmm.
And that is something I think Housing Club is going to lean much harder into as we continue to talk about tenants' rights, as we continue to talk about who is a renter in this town, is to try to shift that narrative around who is renting here. Because it's a wide variety of people. And there are people who are providing really essential services and working in very essential jobs in Anchorage. They're making our lives possible here. So that was part of the pushback. There was what I would consider to be some really legitimate concerns coming from folks who are living higher up the hillside where there's increased risk of landslides. And there's some geographic features, some geological features that might mean, okay, maybe we don't want multifamily homes like up on the hillside at that.
My only pushback is like just allowing it doesn't mean it's going to happen.
Precisely.
And it's who's going to build something that's going to landslide.
That's unsafe.
Yeah.
And so that was part of some pushback that was like, okay, maybe that's reasonable, right? Like maybe this is a place where in the spirit of compromise, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sure. Okay. That particular
Very on hillside.
very up there wild zone. Okay, cool. Leave it.
Mm-hmm.
But for the rest of the Anchorage Bowl, for the Anchorage Metro, like we need more housing here.
Mm-hmm.
And we need the option of taking, for example, the shell of the super decrepit single family home that's across the street from me in Geneva Woods, that's currently unoccupied. Like we need the possibility of that single family home becoming a really nice duplex.
Right.
I would love to have a really nice duplex across the street from me, as opposed to what is currently there, which is a single family home. There's nobody in it, and it is so run down and icky. I would love for there to be life in that space, and right now there isn't. And so personally, I'm delighted that we have shifted, that we've moved the needle, and now duplexes are possible in every residential zone in Anchorage. And you can also build an accessory dwelling unit. You can also add a mother-in-law apartment to your space, which means that, number one, homeowners have way more flexibility in what they can do on their own property, which I think is important. And builders and developers have more options to make buildings pencil out. Because right now, most construction, if you factor in the cost of labor, the cost of permitting, the cost of materials, building a middle-of-the-road single-family dwelling doesn't pencil. It doesn't make sense on paper. And that's why nothing's getting built. Now, a piece of that are going back to zoning and building codes, right? There's a big chunk of our building code. I want to say it's something ridiculous. It's 150 pages. That is all about residential design. These standards that a building has to meet, a proposed building or a proposed remodel has to meet in order to meet these criteria. Some of them are about life, health, and safety. Others are totally arbitrary aesthetic preferences that have just gotten written into our building code.
Do you have an example?
Oh, yeah. For example, if you build something new, let's say you tear down a house and you're building something new, you are required to build a sidewalk in front of this dwelling. There's no sidewalks in Geneva Woods. There's a sidewalk running down McGinnis.
You'd be required to build a sidewalk in front of your house, even though it doesn't connect with any other sidewalks.
Correct. And there's actually, if you wanted to take a look at how this looks in real life, there's a property that Cook Inlet Housing redeveloped on Spenard. And if you drive by, there's a sidewalk in front of it, and it's a sidewalk to nowhere. The sidewalk just wraps the property and then it ends because there's no sidewalk to connect it to. But they had to build that sidewalk in order for that construction to be permitted and able to be built. That's really silly. And I like sidewalks. I'm a big fan. I think our city should be more walkable. And also, an arbitrary sidewalk that doesn't connect to anything increases costs for the construction of the home. Mm-hmm. And it also means that cost is being passed on to the eventual homeowner. Another piece of it is there's a whole section of code that talks about how big your garage can be relative to the front of your house and where the door has to be relative to the street and how big the windows have to be, right? These are all things that don't necessarily have anything to do with the safety of the building or the livability of the building. It's all about aesthetics and optics. But it's in the design standards. And so builders are required to comply with those. What that means on a functional level is that when a builder looks at a piece of property, they have to do some very strange gymnastics in order to make all of those requirements fit in that specific space. And coupled with zoning, that really changes what an architect and a builder can do on a specific lot. And generally speaking, what they're going to build, if it's something that pencils out, is going to be a home that's outside of the price range of that missing middle.
What's the appetite for getting rid of that aesthetic part of the code?
I mean, it's growing. So again, this is really...
And what's the pushback on that?
Yeah, so the pushback is largely we don't want a lot of ugly buildings built like in the 1980s.
But we already have.
Ding, ding. So I think for folks who have been around a while, and the folks who have been around a while are also largely influencing the way that some of these standards have been written. There's this, we don't want to go back to the ugly box houses of the 80s. Full disclosure, I live in an ugly box house that was built in 1969 and I love it. It's, but anyway, there's this prioritization of aesthetics, of optics over function, over the fact that
And price.
We have a legitimate housing crisis on our hands. We don't have the luxury of managing building articulation and how big a garage is or isn't, or how big the front window is, right? Like we just need to build some housing. And what's really difficult is that there are multifamily units that have been built here in Anchorage prior to some of these residential design standards coming into effect that are really lovely, really attractive, really useful multifamily buildings that could not be built today. So what we're ending up with is a lot of multifamily housing that looks identical because developers like Cook Inlet Housing have figured out, okay, this is what works.
This meets the code.
Fits all the standards. And so we can just replicate that out, which means our city doesn't, if we continue down that road, right, our city doesn't actually look that interesting. That neighborhood character everybody's talking about becomes really super flat and like kind of vanilla and boring because we aren't giving builders and developers any license for creativity or to look at a lot and say, this is a weird shaped lot, but we can do this like really cool thing on this interestingly shaped lot.
But it's not going to meet the aesthetic code standards.
Correct. And we could build this really like fun kind of funky triplex, but the code says we can't, or zoning says we can't. And so, again, it's super nerdy policy stuff, but I think a lot of people don't understand that zoning and code and the way that we think about how our land gets used are significant components of how expensive our housing is and how easy or difficult it is to get housing built. And so what Housing Club is trying to do is to start to topple some of those barriers and say, no, we don't want to preserve our city in amber, right? We don't want to say that Anchorage has to look now the way that it did in its heyday. No. But that what we want is for our city to have more density, have more walkability, have more options for people across the price point, across the spectrum. Yes, we need more affordable housing, but we also need more middle worker housing. And if some luxury housing gets built too, and some folks can move up into that part of the housing spectrum, great, because that frees up more properties elsewhere on that spectrum of affordability. And so that's where Housing Club comes in, is to say, okay, we're going to start to advocate for abundant housing everywhere. Anchorage neighbors for more neighbors. That's what we want.
If somebody's listening and they're like, you know what, I really want to be a part of this. I want to help get rid of this unnecessary code. I want to make more abundant housing in Anchorage. Can they join the housing club? How do they do that?
You can email anchoragehousingclub@gmail.com and just say, hey, I'm really interested in what you're up to. One of the things I love about Housing Club is it's intentionally a very broad collection of people. Housing Club includes folks from all over the political spectrum. It includes people who are like builders and developers and realtors, but it also includes like some other like non-housing connected folks that just care about our town. We have some people who are experts in planning and in some of this residential design work. And then we have other people who just have this really amazing vision of what they'd like their neighborhood to be. They want to have, for example, the option of a Fire Island style coffee shop plopped down in the middle of their neighborhood. They're interested in multi-use things. They want a little tiny nail salon to operate out of their neighbor's garage and for that to be legal, right? There's all of these reasons that people come to Housing Club. And we have a very much of an all-comers approach. There's no requirement in the club that you necessarily agree with everyone or everything. And we have some great discussion, great dialogue about some of these issues as they emerge. There are always differences of opinion, and we welcome that. And I think that's one of the strengths of Housing Club, actually, is it's not a monolith. There are always a wide variety of opinions in the room. And so, yeah, anybody's welcome. And send us an email, and I will make sure that you get added to the email list, get added to our internal communication, which we do on Slack. And the more the merrier.
Awesome. And last question. If somebody wanted to get involved with Mutual Aid Network or make a donation or support in some way,
lovely.
How would they do that?
Sure. Great question. So Anchorage Housing Club does not have a functional website yet, but Mana does. And you can visit We Are Mana. That's all spelled out. wearemana.org. And find more information about the Mutual Aid Network. There is a single form where anybody can connect with Mana, whether they have something to offer, something that they need, or something of each, which is very frequently the case, right? Everybody has something that they need, but everybody also has something to offer. You can fill out that Connect form, and one of our organizers will follow up and say hello and welcome you to the network. And there's also a spot to give on the Mana website, which obviously we are always thankful for community generosity and for the support for what we do. Or you can email me directly, and that's really easy. It's Erin@wearemana.org, and Erin is spelled with an E. It's ERIN, and I would love to hear from you.
Erin Baldwin Day, thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
Absolutely. Total pleasure.
Thank you, listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. To contact me, email rep.andrew.gray@akleg.gov or call my office at 907-269-0123.